The Westminster Confession was really a way of ensuring theological orthodoxy after the Reformation, or Reformations really, with different types of Protestantism beginning to emerge. And people were very frightened of the idea of heresy developing in these new denominations. And the most feared heresy was Arianism. Arius was a theologian who lived at the time of Constantine, when Constantine was really choosing Christianity as a religion that he hoped would unify his empire. I don't think that he was really concerned about theological niceties. He just didn't want disagreement. And Arius disagreed with the majority of his contemporary thinkers. The doctrine of the Trinity was beginning to emerge and crystallise at this time, but Arius held the view that the Son was subservient to the Father, that Jesus was subservient to God the Father, or subordinate to him. And this was not the way that the mainstream thinking was developing. And so Arius, who couldn't conform to the mainstream thinking, was banished and his works were burned. So it's difficult for us to know exactly what he thought, but we have some idea of his theology. But it happens that Arius was going to be rehabilitated, and he was coming back into favour a bit again with Constantine about a decade after his banishment, and he was on his way to an important meeting when unfortunately he died, and he died in a very harrowing and ignominious way. And this really cemented his reputation as the arch heretic. And this idea of someone departing from the doctrine of the Trinity haunted the theologians at the time of the Westminster Confession. And even a while before that, there was a man called Michael Servetus. Now, Servetus was a great scientist and a great thinker, and he began to question not the idea of the Trinity, really. He thought the concept of the Trinity was something that he really endorsed, but the doctrine of the Trinity he had some difficulty with, really because he felt it didn't express his full adoration of Jesus, I think. And he first of all fell into disfavour with the Pope, and then with Calvin, and he was eventually burned at the stake in Geneva. He's sometimes thought of as a Unitarian. He was really just an unorthodox Trinitarian thinker, but no unorthodoxy could really be tolerated. There was great fear of it. Other thinkers began to emerge. A man called Josephus Arminius, for instance, who had been educated in Geneva and later on became a professor of theology at Leiden University. And he was the leader of the Dutch Remonstrance. He and his followers came up with a document, a remonstrance, which departed in some respects from Calvinism, and this ultimately led to the foundation of the Dutch Remonstrant Church. Another thinker that we might want to think about was Socinus. Socinus was an Italian, and he was banished and he went to Poland, and he developed ideas which helped in the formation of Unitarian theology and had a big influence on some English thinkers, and also in the development of the Unitarian Church in Transylvania, which is now, of course, part of Romania. Closer to home, Isaac Newton. We think of him as a great scientist, and indeed that's what he was. But many of these thinkers at the time were also theologians. And Newton was very interested in theology, but Newton's theology was Arian. He kept that a secret, and that's how he manages to have a magnificent tomb in Westminster Abbey. And so we have these different ideas, and we have the emergence of what's known as the Enlightenment. And there were thinkers from here who influenced the Enlightenment, for instance, Francis Hutcheson and Hans Sloane, the founder of what became the British Museum. And we have the Enlightenment in Scotland, and of course many Presbyterian ministers from Ireland were going to Scotland for their education, and some of them were falling under the influence of these new ideas. And this was great interest to a group of ministers who were led by a man called John Abernethy. And they founded something called the Belfast Society in 1705. And this was a society really for people to test their theological ideas against these new scientific and philosophical developments that were emerging. And this caused a great deal of concern for the more orthodox of the church leaders of the time. And at the same time, a man called Thomas Emlyn, the Reverend Thomas Emlyn in Wood Street in Dublin, started to express Arianism and Unitarian ideas, and he ended up being tried and imprisoned, and a very heavy fine was imposed upon him. He was eventually reprieved and his fine was reduced, but nonetheless these different ideas were causing a lot of agitation at the time, and subscription to the Westminster Confession, particularly among the Synod of Ulster, was considered essential, again, to try to ensure orthodoxy among its clergy. But things really came to a head with the installation in First Church in Rosemary Street, Belfast, of a man called Samuel Halliday. Several of the ministers of the time had been educated in Geneva or in Leiden, or both, and Halliday had been educated in Europe. And he had become ambivalent about the Westminster Confession, and when he was installed in First Church in 1720, he declined to sign, and he was not compelled to sign. And this was considered a bit of a rebellion by the authorities. And thus really began something called the First Subscription Controversy. And this lasted for about 5 years as people tried to iron out what was the best way forward. And eventually a special presbytery was formed, the Presbytery of Antrim, and all of the more radical non-subscribing thinkers were put into that, and they were effectively told that they were denied ministerial communion with their followers, and the idea was to isolate them and perhaps to allow these ideas to wither on the vine. But the Presbytery of Antrim was supported by the Presbytery of Dublin at the time, what became really the Synod of Munster, what we know now as the Synod of Munster, and they said that they would continue in communion with their colleagues. And during the 18th century, insistence on subscription became considered less important as the furore of the early part of the century died away. And it was in that furore at the beginning of the 18th century that the congregation in Moneyreagh was established, and that's what we'll think about next time.